So, Stephen, why don't you introduce yourself?
G'day, guys. I'm a professor at GW in DC, and my research is in tax economics. So I do research on kind of when the government changes the tax settings. They raise tax rates or they give a rebate or something. I use tax data from the IRS, or in Australia, I use some of their tax data to work out how people respond to those tax incentives, and that kind of tells us how to configure better tax policy, and it also lets us sort of learn things about behavior, which is pretty cool.
So, are you looking more at the consumer side of tax policy, or are you looking more at the business side of it, or both?
So I do both. At the moment, a lot of the projects I'm working on are people, right? So I have a kind of a bunch of interesting projects looking at if you give people a really sharp tax incentive, so you say to people, cut your income to get this tax rebate or something like that. What do they change in their tax return to try and do that? Do they claim a lot more deductions? And do these incentives have permanent effects on their behavior? Can they help people learn about the tax system, right? How to game the tax system and things like that. But you could apply a lot of these things to firms as well, right? Because firms pay tax just like people do. So yeah, it's funny when I tell people I'm a tax economist, it's often, you sort of think it's boring, but actually I reckon it's super interesting, and it delves deep into kind of behavior, and interesting kind of behavioral angles. So,
well, the interesting part of tax economics to me has always been the behavior side of it, and less like how much money we're going to raise, which is obviously a part of the behavior side. But
right.
More just like so if you create a system of incentives, like how do people respond in that system of incentives?
Exactly. So there are legal aspects and there are accounting aspects. Yeah, you have to implement all this stuff, and I talk a lot to tax lawyers. But my course here at GW is all about the concepts. It's all about these sort of ideas, how to design a tax system so that it generates behaviors that are better than otherwise, right? So it doesn't generate a lot of distortions and mess with people too much. How can we kind of harness the tax system to get people to do what we want rather than what we don't want? And, there's a lot of considerations. There's, inequality, there's kind of distortions to people's behavior. So there's a lot of things, there's complexity, there's a lot of things we have to kind of weigh up when we're deciding, what to do. So yeah.
Someone in the chat just asked, how does behavioral econ figure into your work?
Very heavily. So here's one example. So, you have this neoclassical economic model that says people behave in a frictionless way, they respond to incentives immediately. If you have that model, you go and look at the tax data, you cannot reconcile that model with what you see in the data. In some instances, people in the data, when you give them an incredibly strong incentive, and I mean like a marginal tax rate of 30,000%, some like massive shock, some people don't respond at all, right? Their taxes don't affect their behavior at all, either because they're not aware of the shock, or they're constrained in terms of how they can respond, right? And then there's other people who do respond, right? And when they respond to the tax policy, but then you take the incentive away, so let the incentive just be a one-off thing. You take the incentive away, and then that response continues, right? So you've permanently changed the way those people behave. So these kinds of dynamics of behavior simply can't be explained in like a standard neoclassical framework. So a lot of the modern public finance literature is all about these kind of behavioral questions. How does the tax system affect people? How can we acknowledge people's behavioral limitations and design a tax system that either exploits them or it at least takes account of them?
And your research has been super relevant recently because of a lot of the public discussion around stimulus. So obviously we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. And one of the things people really want to know is, what are we going to do? Because obviously the pandemic is a large public health issue. But a whole other facet of this is the fact that we're going to have a massive economic downturn. I've seen projections as low as a 10% quarterly GDP contraction. And now one person on Twitter in particular, like Matt Darling, who is in the chat right now, has been talking about just cutting everyone a check. Give everyone $1,000. That's it. don't discriminate, don't means test, everyone gets $1,000.
Yes.
And I've seen you kind of push back on that idea a little bit, and I'm curious why and how it ties into your behavioral econ tax research.
Yeah, sure. So the thing I would say first is I'm not a macroeconomist, right? So I'm trained in macroeconomics. I passed a prelim in macroeconomics. I turns out I'm highly knowledgeable about macroeconomics, but that's not what I do in my research, right? So when there's a normal business cycle, when an economy goes into recession, I know the standard things, but I'm not really an expert in that space, right? I'm a tax economist. I know how to give and take money from people, right? And what effects it has, and how to do that in a way that's fair and, makes the most sense, right? Now, it turns out that, and I've been trying to make this point far and wide, the coronavirus in and of itself does not cause a normal business cycle kind of recession, right? The economy was going brilliantly 2 months ago. Gangbusters.
A month ago.
Jobs growth. Yeah, exactly. Jobs growth, continued jobs growth. Claudia Sam, this great macroeconomist, was on a podcast with Maddie Glacius just 6 weeks ago, where she said, everything is fine, everything looks great. Her rule that tells you what's going to happen with the economy is looking good. So the fundamentals of the economy are extremely sound, but we've got a global pandemic, right? So we have this massive shock to the economy that frankly is kind of unprecedented, right? The way I've described it, so you can think about it a couple of ways. One way is like a natural disaster, right? So you can think about it like a natural disaster that's sort of lasts 2 to 3 months and affects every country in the world at the same time. So this is like not a small economic shock, right? And so what we have to think about is two things. One, what is the immediate effect of this thing, right? And what can we do to mitigate those effects on people? And two, how should we think about the medium term? So once the immediate crisis of pandemic has passed, how should we think about policy in that time frame to make sure that this short-term economic shock, which is inevitable, doesn't turn into a really long-lived, painful, deep recession, right? So all of our policy measures should be configured with those two things in mind. And that gets us to cash stimulus. So here's the thing. In a normal recession, a normal recession is kind of driven by a big contraction in demand. For example, people stop going out to buy durable goods, right? So they stop buying cars, they stop buying washing machines, right? Because their demand contracts, maybe because they're worried about economic conditions in the future, they're pessimistic, right? So they cut back on demand. And in that kind of demand-driven recession, a reasonable response, which people call the Keynesian kind of response, is for the government to just inject massive amounts of cash as widely as they can throughout the whole economy, right? To get money in people's hands so they go out and spend. So they go out and buy cars and washing machines and go out to dinner and do all the other things to just pump up economic activity, right? And in a normal recession, I would advocate that. Now, a lot of people are skeptical of whether that's possible, whether that's a good idea, right? So there's a bit of a divide ideologically on whether we should do that, right? But I'm in that camp. I think, yes, if we were in a normal recession, go for it, right? But the problem we have right now is there's nothing wrong with the fundamentals of demand, right? People are contracting in their demand because they have to, right? Like, you're not going out to dinner because if you do, you're going to either catch a virus or give it to somebody else. So the problem with giving someone cash as stimulus right now is you'll either, one, increase their demand, which is potentially harmful to other people, right? You don't want people to go out to dinner. Or two, they'll sit on it, right? You give them the cash and they sit on that cash. And so it doesn't actually do anything for demand. Demand is kind of unmovable, right? So that's kind of the problem we're in. The other thing is we're supply constrained. So, I joked on Twitter the other day that, you give people cash and they go and buy even more Purell than they already are. Or toilet paper, right? So there's all these supply constraints in labor supply. People aren't going to work. They're not going to spend. And there's really nothing we can do about that. Now, I want to be really clear to you. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, right? It just means we need to think a little bit about what problem we have and what tools are the best to solve that problem, right? So I would advocate, if we were in a perfect world, not constrained by this terribly antiquated, fiscal transfer system that we have, I would prefer to get a lot of money very quickly in the pockets of the poorest people in the country, or the people in the country who are most affected by this shock. Like the hourly workers whose wages are going to get cut, who are going to get laid off because businesses have to close. I would like to get as much money, literally, as we can into those people's pockets as quickly as we possibly can. And the second thing I would like to do is get money in the hands of the businesses that those people work for, so that we can ensure that those businesses survive through this temporary period of depressed demand, which we can't do anything about, right? So that on the other side, when the crisis abates, there'll be jobs for those people to go back to, right? If we let those firms fail, the virus goes away, it's going to take a really long time for the economy to get back up to steam. And you have a prolonged period of unemployment, and you have a lot of really, really bad effects.
Which is really the case for bailouts, quote unquote, is that you don't want, like, airlines are huge employers in the United States. So not only are you going to be causing a huge labor shock if they was go out of business, but you're going to be causing a huge issue to just getting people around the country. If we want our economy to rebound in 3 months by flipping a switch,
you need to help it through. Exactly. So I would say something about the bailout comment, which has been said in some places, like, I am a kind of in some cases I agree. Like, you want to give firms and people incentives, the right incentives, right? You don't want to give them a crutch. Like, I get that. I agree. But a pandemic like this happens once every 100 years. Right?
God willing.
It hasn't happened since 1918. And it's a really unique kind of shock, right? And there is nothing, you couldn't insure against the income shock that this entails, right? A huge portion of businesses in America are going to close and have no revenue. A huge number of workers in America are going to stop going to work and have no income. And that's all happening at the same time. So if there was insurance for this, any insurer that offered it would go bust, right? So to me, the case here for government intervention is so strong in the sense of the government being the insurer of last resort, right? The backstop.
Interesting way to put it.
When there's this huge systemic risk that nobody except the government could insure against, right? They have to be there to help people to smooth their consumption through time. That means offering people loans, businesses loans, people loans, right? But it also means stepping in and plugging the income gap that people and firms have. So the one last thing I would say about the checks, which I've been averse to sending out the checks, because I think if we have this fixed budget, right, which inevitably politically we do, the Congress isn't going to authorize an unlimited amount of funding for this thing. If we have a fixed budget, then I'm really worried that if we give everyone a $1,000 check, right, that's simply like, I don't need a $1,000 check, right? But someone who's about to lose their, either lose their job or be radically reduced in terms of income. And to be clear, like, unemployment insurance is like your income gets halved. So if you're a minimum wage worker, your minimum wage income is half the minimum wage for 26 weeks, right? These people need a hell of a lot more than $1,000, right? So if we have a fixed budget, what I wanted is give that money to the poorest people.
Yeah, because the office workers that are currently at home might be suffering some difficulties. But I think in the case of like me and you, who can do our jobs almost 100% remotely,
it doesn't make any
sense for us to be getting $1,000 checks. I would love $1,000. Don't get me wrong, but I would much rather for the economy not to collapse and for have my favorite restaurant to stay open.
Exactly. And the problem is, like, in a normal recession, we would care a little less about the distribution, because you give me $1,000 and I'm going to go out and spend it, and that helps keep someone else in a job. But that isn't going to happen now. You give me $1,000 tomorrow, and it is going to have no effect on my behavior whatsoever, right? And so even the thing you want the $1,000 to do for the wealthier people it's just not going to do it, right? So the only thing I would say, and I think Jason Furman, who's a wonderful guy, he's was Obama's CEA chair during the the in the aftermath of the previous crisis. He raised the point today, and this is a serious issue that I think we should talk about, and that I cannot believe we didn't learn the lessons of 2008 about. He said on Twitter today that if you want to send a check, like Mitt Romney has proposed, of $1,000 to every American, it takes 3 months. It takes 3 months. So if you decide today, if the House and Senate passed a bill today to send out $1,000 checks to everyone in the country, it would be here in the middle of June.
Why would it take 3 months?
It's the infrastructure. you have to literally, all of the government machinery has to kick into drive and do all of the things it needs to do to find where to send the checks to, and then actually use the mail service to send the checks to people. And so his point was, I agree, we don't need $1,000 checks to everyone today, but we may very well need $1,000 checks for everyone in the middle of June, once the contagion has gone, right? And the economy needs to start moving again. Now, maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but it wouldn't be a bad piece of insurance for the government to start the ball rolling on that now, so that as the economy is recovering after the coronavirus outbreak, there's this shot of cash to get things moving again.
Someone in the chat asked if they gave you $1,000, would you be able to clean your whiteboard?
I think I said on Twitter earlier, my whiteboard is terrible. It's made of some kind of melamine or something, and it's really hard to wipe off the pen, and so I just let it go. And now I just carve out smaller and smaller slices of the whiteboard to try and draw diagrams. My tax research is very graphical. All of these things you see back here are the density of taxable income. How many people earn what income level, and how that thing responds to changes in tax incentives. So that's why it looked like that. But anyway, so the bigger point with this cash issue, and it's something that Claudia Sam mentioned before, has been going on about really for a long time. And I think she's dead right. We need to build some automatic stabilizers into the system, right? That send money to people for fiscal support automatically, right? And in a way that's fast, right? And in a way that can be triggered when it needs to be triggered. And I cannot believe that we went through that crisis 12 years ago.
And we didn't get those.
We've done nothing.
And we've been talking about automatic stabilizers since. The topic hasn't gone away.
It's insane. Yeah. So I agree. I mean, I would say, I would strongly agree. If it's true that the checks take 3 months, get the checks going. I agree. Yes, fine. But the problem with that is people are not going to survive 3 months. Minimum wage workers who are on unemployment insurance, millions of these people, to be clear, millions of these people. We're not talking it's millions of people who are on the minimum wage who are going to be on unemployment insurance. And it's $230 a week.
It's like nothing.
Like, what the hell are you going to do with $230 a week? You can't pay your rent. You can't make your car payments. You can't make, credit card payments. You struggle to get groceries. You can't pay any of your bills. And some of these things will be forgiven, but people are not going to be able to survive this, right? So in addition to the checks, my argument is, and I've been trying to ask people on Twitter, what do we do? How do we do this? Whatever we can do to get money in those people's pockets in 2 weeks, I'm talking hundreds of billions of dollars, we should do that. People on Medicaid, people getting on the EITC, people on SNAP, people on TANF, right? Anyone who is a vulnerable person in society, we need to get them money as quickly as possible.
That's a good point, because we know that the people who are already in those programs are needy at some level. So while we may not be precisely targeting people with programs like that, it's much better than just cutting everyone a $1,000 check. And the infrastructure is already in place for those to cut people checks.
Yes. Now, the people on Twitter tell me that it's quite hard, that's a difficult thing to do in terms of logistics, right? And I get that, but just bloody make it happen. I mean, we are in a crisis. Have some public servants work, like, think of this like the Apollo mission. Seriously, right? And have some people working around the clock to figure this out. I don't care how. It doesn't need to be perfect, right? We shouldn't be too precious about it. Get some people together, figure it out, get the people the money right now. Don't worry about the deficit. Don't worry about anything else. Get it done. Now, the biggest problem of all is it's not clear to me at this stage how seriously the Congress is taking this problem. And at the end of the day, all of this has to be passed by them. So we're kind of at their whim.
I'm honestly kind of optimistic about how Congress has been acting. I was happy when I saw that at least Mitch McConnell canceled recess for this week. So originally Senate was like not even going to be in session, and they ended that, which is good.
Yeah.
But they're like passing stuff, and it looks like there's like some level of bipartisan alarm about this. But then, of course, you've got like senators going out to ribs restaurants, taking selfies about like coronavirus can't get me in the restaurant. But I'm like cautiously optimistic about the fiscal support coming through.
So Tom Cotton was on I think MSNBC or something this morning saying two things. One, like, we need a much more ambitious response than what we saw in the bill, which I agree with. But then I saw some tweets later that said, well, he's wanting to pull the bill that the House, reject the bill that the House put forward and then propose something different. And that just means delay. My view would be get the bloody bill out, pass it, whatever, and then work on the next one, right? And then we can all have an argument about whether how much we should give to business, how much we should give in these $1,000 checks, how much we should target, but like, get the sick leave out, get the medical funding out, everything that we need, get it out as quickly as possible. So that was a little concerning. But yeah, it's crazy times, man. Absolutely crazy times. I feel like
we're watching
You're in DC, right?
Well, I'm in DC, but I evacuated to Philly with my girlfriend for the length of the quarantine on Friday because I was like, you know what? I don't want to be caught in DC alone when I can't leave. So I was like, I will leave when I can leave.
Are you from Philly?
No, I'm from New York originally, hence the accent that sometimes comes out. I got people that chat harassing me for it.
I love Philly. I go there every Thanksgiving. Americans seem to have a real issue with Philly. I don't know. When you talk about Philly, Americans get a bit, I don't know. They're kind of the underdogs, aren't they? But I love the city. I would love to be there now, but nothing's open. So what can you do?
I'm going to yell at, but Americans do have an issue with Philly, and I think it's kind of deserved.
So I love it, but I tweeted this morning. DC is just a ghost town. Like, I mean, I ride my bike every day to work. I live in 8th Street Northeast, and and my office is in Foggy Bottom, and I ride my bike about 4 miles, and it felt like Sunday. If you ride downtown in DC on a Sunday, it's dead, right? It felt like Sunday, and it's a Monday. And I don't know, this is not going to be a week. This is going to be months like this, right? So I'm really worried. And I think to some degree, people are taking it a lot more seriously than they were. But I'm just really worried that people haven't, because it's not salient to people.
It's not like Twin Towers falling down. It's not pictures of the invasion happening in Iraq. It's this invisible virus, and it's not like we're having these like pictures come out of like people dying. You can't see the virus. It's like there's not chaos in the streets. It's just like eerily calm is the issue, and I feel like people aren't reacting enough because there isn't a visual cue of like how bad this is.
Yeah. So in some ways, I'm quite happy about. I mean, I think some of these measures that have been announced, are a bit extreme. Probably more than we need, but the fact that people are just not taking it seriously enough, I think really justifies a lot of these pretty intense measures. It's pneumonia. People get pneumonia. That's what happens with this virus. And it's like, well, what does that mean? I've never seen someone have pneumonia. I don't know what it sounds like when someone with pneumonia tries to breathe, I think, you hear these stories from Italy. I mean, 350 people a day in a small region. Like Lombardy is like a small region of northern Italy. It's like a tiny region. 350 people a day are dying of pneumonia. It's insane. So, I think there's still a sense, people still have a little sense of like, oh, we'll escape that, right? And a lot of that has been facilitated by the lack of testing.
I was
which has
happy
been a
to
real...
see today that we finally reached doing 11,000 tests a day, which I think is extremely up from last week, which is good, but not enough.
I hope it gets better. My wife said in DC there are 15 tests a day.
That's bad. Yeah, last week I had what I thought were symptoms of like I was coughing, I felt a little achy, and I was like, well, I don't think this is it, but if there was testing abundant, I'd get tested just to be safe. But that didn't exist, and there was no place to get tested.
Yes. Yes. Even if you were admitted to hospital, the only way you would get tested is if you met these criteria. So you had to have come in contact with a known case or been to the affected regions, right? But if you were just some person who had community transmission,
they don't care.
They didn't test you. And so the other thing that people are saying, like we're sort of tracking the case rates online and we're tracking the death rates, but like both the case rates and the death rates are both, I think, radically undermeasured, right? Because if someone died of bilateral pneumonia and tested negative for the flu, I mean, 99% they had coronavirus, right? But if we don't test them, how do we know? And they don't get logged in the data. So I don't know. I think this lack of testing has kind of, I worry that it's kind of lulled us into a false sense of security. But I've been saying for a while, you know, this thing has been walking around in the population for 2 months, and every person infects 2 other people potentially.
Well, I saw some nurses on Twitter yesterday talking about, or I guess one viral tweet, which was like, a few months ago, we had this string of people just dying of pneumonia. They would come in, they would test negative to the flu, and then they would die of pneumonia. And they're like, now we're looking back, they're like, we think these were coronaviruses, or much earlier.
Yes.
Which, I mean, I don't know the amount of truth to that, but I do think once we look back on this, there will be a little bit of retrospection of like, this was here well before we got worried about it, and that's what's partially causing the problem.
I think that's right. America is a really big country, and we're really spread out, right? It's not necessarily going to spread like wildfire all across the country very quickly, right? So it's going to be localized in certain areas. So it hits until it hits a nursing home where there's an extreme concentration of effects. It doesn't show up, right? But you know, I said to my friends, you know, a couple of friends who are sort of in this world 3-4 weeks ago, even at this point, there are probably tens of thousands of Americans walking around with this thing, and we have no idea, right? So I think the testing for me is just such a massive failure, and you know, we're so far behind on that that I just really worry that as it rolls out, we're going to learn that it's much more widespread than what we know.
And I don't even want to I'm almost even a little hesitant to like armchair criticize the public health response, because I genuinely don't know how you spin up testing.
No, me neither.
The only criticism that I've seen that's been like real salient for me has just been like FDA red tape, of like the FDA has been like a real pain in the ass for people who are like coming up with testing solutions, and they're like, no, you need to pass all these restrictions first. And it seems like now in hindsight we can look back, and I think they did change the rule over the weekend of like, they should have been able to do this much earlier.
Yes.
And this would have avoided some of the problems we're seeing in like Seattle right now.
Right, but I think at least in a lot of cases they are dropping that pretty fast. They've got with the program. They're starting to kick into gear and understand the seriousness of it. But yeah, I'm just really worried. So I still think, you know, a lot of people who think, so rolling back to the fiscal story, a lot of people who think that $1,000 checks are going to be enough. I mean, the economic costs of this thing are going to be incalculable, like extremely large. And I think there was a great quote by John Cochrane, who's this great economist at the Hoover Institution, who, you know, he's a bit of a, you know, crazy dude, but I always enjoy his writing. You know, he said, stopping the economy is not like switching off a light. It's like turning off a nuclear reactor, right? And I think that degree of inertia, you know, is a really important factor here. So we need to smooth this process out. And if we don't do that, things could get very bad. But I, you know, you talk to business owners, you go and talk to my local coffee shop owner, local restaurants. My wife works at a DC restaurant. It's still taking a while to sink in. They're still thinking, what's going to happen to me? Can we just get by doing takeaway orders, or to what degree can we pull back? Do we need to start laying off workers? It could change very quickly, right? When all of these people figure out that they're going to have to switch things off.
Yeah.
Either because local governments change laws and say they have to close, right, which is happening all over the country. But if it happens quick, the fiscal system has to be ready to support the people that are going to be affected.
And if I was an all-powerful technocrat, my solution just would be to this is just like, look, you close, we'll support you. You're not going to go under because of this. And that would just incentivize people just to close their restaurants, because I don't think any restaurant owner wants to put people in danger. But they're looking at the situation of like, what's worse? Like a few of my employees getting coronavirus, or like my business going under and everyone getting laid off. And that's a real calculus that's going on in their head. You can't blame them for that.
Yes. So something I've called for is so there's a couple of policy options in the short term that we can think about, which is so how do we support businesses through this time? So there've been some proposals which I found really interesting. So one by Tim Bartik. Who, if there are any economists listening, will know the Bartik instrument is kind of famous. Tim Bartik is where that name comes from. He's proposed sort of a tax credit plan where the amount of tax credits that you give to firms is tied to how many of their workers they keep on, right? So if you don't just give firms a tax credit, you give them a tax credit that's contingent on them maintaining workers, then that encourages them not to lay people off. Right. And a plan like that. So one of the big problems where these recessions can come from is detachment. Right. So if workers and firms are detached from each other, hey, I just had another Twitch conversation where someone else's partner came in, and it just reminds me of that dude in South Korea. Remember when his kids came in the back of the and I'm lucky I'm not doing this from home, because my daughter would be totally like, in the background.
I'll just be upfront with everyone right now. Like, I am in the closet of this apartment, and the bathroom door is right there. So occasionally the stream is just going to go off, and there's just going to be people moving in and out of the bathroom. And we're just going to be honest with the viewers right now that this is what's happening.
Yes, we're on a war footing. You just make do with what you have. But a big thing you worry in a recession is detachment. Like, you don't want all of these. The economy is built on relationships, right? Like, you think of what a business is. A business is a relationship between customers and firms and their workers, firms and their suppliers, right? These links between all of these things are like what is the fabric of the economy, right? And if one firm goes down, that has ripple effects on all of the other people, the customers, the employees, the suppliers, right? The landowners, the people who they rent from. And if this thing starts to spread out, all of these links get detached. And it's not like the economy comes back and all of these links just get reformed again, right? A lot of come in, don't worry about it. a lot of these links, they take a long time to come back online. And a lot of the intangible capital, the human capital, the ideas, the relationships, the products, a lot of these things, if you don't keep those links together, they'll be lost forever. Mm-hmm. And the loss of economic value that would be associated with that kind of massive collapse are serious. Yeah. Serious.
And that's the really hard stuff to nail down, because you can't quantify social capital. You can't quantify the amount of lost business revenue because people can't have in-person meetings anymore. Like, I work in a think tank. A lot of my job involves getting coffee with people just to, like, chat with them and build a relationship. And I can't do that now. So it's a lot of, like, Skyping people, sending emails, hoping that, like, someone who's older who might not be savvy with, like, emailing or doing some sort of, like, conversation over Skype will, like, understand that, like, I can't come to your office and meet you. Like, that's dangerous and stupid and reckless.
So in one way, I mean, we could try and be a little positive. So someone, I don't know if she's listening, but Liz Pancotti on Twitter, who's a great person. She was joking that, this, touching the iPad local shops is like a disaster for this virus, right? And I joked and said, use your elbow. Right?
Saw that.
And she said, she said, I used the sweet potato. And my reply was, well, this pandemic is going to cause untold innovation. And I mean, that's a joke, right? Because we all have to try and keep ourselves entertained throughout this terrible time. But it's actually true. It'll be fascinating to see what kinds of innovations are driven by this, this pandemic. It forces people to come up with creative solutions to problems that they wouldn't otherwise have come up with.
I said this morning that I think this is going to convince a lot of offices that this idea that work from home is this thing that should be avoided at all costs is going to go completely out of the window. And I think we're going to see, I wouldn't call it a revolution in work from home, but I think we're going to start seeing this creep of people just being like, okay, it's fine if this office that is completely done on computers can work from home instead of being in the office.
At the very least, it's an experiment.
Yeah, it's a forced experiment.
That we're all being forced to take, right? Not a controlled one, let's be clear. So the other one is education. I mean, I'm a professor, so I hope maybe some of my students are listening. So hello if they are. But this is a really interesting time for education. So there's already on the horizon these kind of dark clouds on education, like what is going to happen to the American higher education space in the next 20 years, right? Are we going to move online? And if we move online, then this superstar phenomenon takes over, where it's like the one person who's really awesome is going to do all the teaching, right? So people have been kind of wondering about what was going to happen with education, and then comes along this pandemic where we're forced to move to this online platform very quickly, right? And that's going to be very interesting to see to what degree that shock leads to kind of permanent change in that space. I personally don't like it. I find Kim Klossing on Twitter, another great person who I think you guys have interviewed before.
We have interviewed her before. I'll have to bring her on this at some point to talk about supply chain, trade stuff in relation to the outbreak.
Yeah, she's fantastic. And she also has great ideas about how tax policy might
I read her book. It's great. For anyone who's interested in the progressive case for taxation and all that stuff. Should read her book. It's called Open.
Yeah, it's really good. So hang on, what was I saying? I lost my train of thought. We were just saying
about online classes.
Education. Yeah, her point was there is something about in person that is essential, and I'm sympathetic to that view. Like, as a teacher, there is a barrier here that, I mean, this is kind of amazing talking to you. Like, I mean, we've never met before, although we've DM'd, and we were going to have a coffee, but we canceled because of the coronavirus, right? Because we work just not that far
away. I think
away
like 3 blocks away from each other or something.
Right. And this is really cool, like talking to you. It's very personal, but there is something different, right, about not being in person. So there's always going to be a place, I think, for in-person communication in education, right? So, but it might end up being something like we might find from this that a lot of the aspects of education work just fine this way, and that maybe the in-person stuff is more supplementary, right? So one person does all the lecturing, but then we have small in-person consultations that are more about tutorials, right? More about personal one-on-one teaching, and that we find that that's really all we need. But that'll be super interesting. At the very least, a lot of firms and universities are forced to invest the large fixed costs, right now in doing that. Training, subscriptions. Some universities that didn't have Zoom subscriptions are being forced to negotiate with Zoom when they're in an extremely favorable position right now.
And I like how Zoom was like, we'll give it free to K-12 schools. Universities, you got to pay for it.
Exactly. Extract all the money from the universities you can. So it's hard to believe that every university in America is going to engage in incur all of these fixed costs, right? The hassle costs, the learning, the kind of the financial costs. And then do nothing. Just go with business as usual.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's going to be a super fascinating thing to watch over the next year or two. How this pandemic plays out.
Yeah. Right. No, I do think it's interesting. And I had a question that I totally lost my train of thought as you went on. But no, I think that's really an excellent point, and I think the really interesting facet was talking about how like you have these superstar professors. Like I think anyone who is took classes in the field of economics knows that there are good professors and that there are really bad economics professors, and I'm sure you're one of the good ones.
Right.
But it just so happens
the Australian accent helps, mate, you know?
It keeps people's attention.
Justin Wolfers, who is one of my advisors at Michigan, you know, he's got the Australian accent, and he's, you know, the students love him. So we have a little bit of an advantage, I think, because people like that accent. But you know, as for my teaching skills, you'll have to ask my students. I don't know.
Well, one person in the chat did ask if you'll make the class pass-fail. You don't have to answer that question, but they're in this chat lobbying for... I think so. He's asked for it to be pass-fail, so I'm assuming that he's one of your students.
Yeah, look, that's a university policy. I couldn't possibly comment. But we will be online. So what I did, I announced this on Twitter this morning. So I do a course on taxation, right? And it covers every aspect of taxation that you could imagine, right? It just so happened that the next week's class was on externalities. Right?
There you go.
Externalities and Pigouvian taxation. And usually I use the global warming as an example, which is, you know, the greatest threat to the planet currently, and so is a great example. But you know, we're suffering from a huge problem of externalities right now, right? A serious failure of collective action. And that's forcing us to think about how we use government tools to solve that problem. So, you know, there is a lovely felicity to having this externality topic in the middle of a pandemic. So I'm converting all of next week's classes to like the economics of the coronavirus, basically. And we're going to do it on Zoom, right? So I haven't done it, so we're going to see how that goes. But I'm really excited to kind of delve into a lot of the issues we talked today about, right? And a lot of the other issues like creative solutions to try and solve these problems. And we'll see. But yeah, other than that, I mean, I think our GW is announced that they're going online until the end of spring break, 1 week after spring break, at the end of the month, basically. And we haven't got guidance yet from the faculty, from the leadership of the university as to what will happen after that time.
I think my alma mater closed for the rest of the semester. I think so.
Yeah, that's happening at.
I know it's like half and half.
Yes, that's happening in a lot of places. So if it happens to us, you know, I'll have to think about what happens. You know, there's difficulties about exams, like how do you give exams? We're going to have to think about potentially giving online exams or 24-hour limited exams or something like that. But I think the experience hopefully will still be good. And at the very least, it'll be an experiment, you know, to work out whether this stuff is doable.
I was thinking a week ago or so.
Oh yeah, go
on. How this is going to affect grades, and I wonder if you'll see that people like juniors right now who are going to be applying for PhD programs in the fall are going to have an advantage or a disadvantage based on this by like their acceptance rates. Because I know like the majority of applicants for like PhD programs are usually outgoing seniors, but then there's always a mix of like people coming from pre-doc programs and professional programs and master students and whatnot, and whether or not they'll have an advantage over seniors in other cohorts based on their grade point average. Like for example, like
so there's
actually continue.
No, you go.
Oh no, I already forgot my example already. Well, you.
Okay, it's hard to keep your track of thought in this environment. No, so it's a question. Like you have to, I guess, think about there's heterogeneity among students. Like this, we're all very different people, right? So some students, I think, are perfectly fine to do more independent learning, right? And in fact, they might prefer more independent learning. They might feel like sitting in a lecture is a waste of time. Just give me the book or just give me the notes or whatever, right? But then there are other students, and I'm like one of those people, where having someone explain it to me in person and being able to ask them questions, right, and sort of tease out the ideas is just how I learn, right? So I think it's those kinds of people who will find this kind of difficult, right? And we have to think of ways to try and cater to those people. So one way is like having a chat, you know, chat DM kind of possibilities where they can ask questions. I don't know how well Zoom does with like audible questioning from like a large number of people. I can't imagine it does very well when I'm lecturing to 30 people. But it'll be interesting to see. So I worry a little bit about that, about the heterogeneous effects across the cohort, right? So some people will lose, and you worry about that. But we're going to try and do whatever we can to try and offset a lot of that sort of difficulty.
And what was your question before I jumped in with mine?
I was going to ask you what you're thinking about at the moment. Like, because we've talked a lot about coronavirus, and I think that's like good. But like, is there anything that you have been thinking about lately that you care a lot about, or you're interested in, that like we can talk about something else for a little bit?
Yeah, I know we only have 10 minutes left, so I'll keep it brief. Honestly, coronavirus has really occupied most of my like thinking recently. And I flip between like caring about the public health aspect and caring about the economic aspect.
Yes.
One of the interesting questions is like, genuinely, what's going to be worse? Like, we know people die in recessions. Like, what is going to be the most impactful part of this? Is it going to be literally the virus, or is it going to be the public disruption to the virus?
Yes, there's no question. I mean, it has to, right?
Yeah.
We have a lot of evidence that, I mean, things like the effect on crime. I mean, that's kind of like you don't think of that channel, but it's feasible, right? Some people were saying on Twitter that the cutback in industrial production will have an offsetting effect on health outcomes, which is kind of an interesting idea, in the sense that like the slowdown in production means that the pollutants lower, which has beneficial effects to the population, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I think we don't know. There's so many unknowns here, in how this is going to wash out. One thing I wondered what you thought about was this coronavirus epidemic. Someone, I can't remember who it was, but someone said on Twitter, like, there's a kind of a meme going around that like you're a libertarian until a pandemic, right? So if you want to be a libertarian, you've got to be a libertarian in a pandemic too, right? But then someone, maybe it was Alan, I don't know. Someone
it was Alec. I saw Alec tweet the neoliberal.
Alec,
everyone's a neoliberal in a pandemic.
Yes. So like you could see people dropping regulations left, right, and center, right? Like they were talking about the FDA before. A lot of people, there was this bizarre regulation from New Jersey that like trucks can only be used for one thing and not for another thing.
New Jersey's a ton of weird transportation regulations.
Other goods. So they've just dropped a lot of these regulations, right, because of the need. And I wonder to what degree this leads to a loosening in a lot of these kind of constraints after the thing subsides. I don't know.
I think someone tweeted, and Jeremiah, who helps run the Neoliberal project with me, kind of amplified it. It's like every ideology is a little bit right and a little bit wrong in this pandemic. It's like the libertarians are right about some like overregulation, but they're wrong about just like general like coordination problems that the government has to intervene with here. Socialists are right about having more healthcare capacity that we don't currently have, but they're wrong about some of the regulation and also like this idea that government services being free right now is the issue. It's more of a supply issue. We just need to have more of it. Again, I can always claim that maybe neoliberalism is the most fungible of all these, and I'm just like, everyone's right, and we should take all their ideas and adapt them into what we're currently saying. But I do think that there's no winning ideology in a pandemic except maybe some hardcore authoritarianism. Pragmatism. But I think pragmatism is not an ideology.
Is neoliberalism?
I think neoliberalism is pragmatic, but I think if I claim that neoliberalism was just another word for pragmatism, I'd get yelled at. So I won't make that claim.
It's not populism. Let's be clear. But but there is a feeling of like just throw everything at it, right? Like whatever works, because we're in a crisis, we need to move quickly, right? And that kind of that notion tends to make you throw ideology out the window, right? Panic. So I think what we need, like we said before, the key thing is to try and learn lessons from this for the long term so that we don't have to do that. We don't have to be so panicked, so that we have systems in place that can respond without needing to take desperate measures, right? So I would just tell you, like, I mean, I don't really have a political affiliation. I mean, I voted, I'm Australian, I voted for both sides of politics. So I'm not a kind of hard sort of political person. But, you know, I went to college. So I started college in 2004. And someone joked on Twitter that if you go to college, you either become a Marxist or a libertarian, right? So I was an economics student, and I took this course on comparative economic systems. So at the University of Queensland in Australia, with this amazing professor. And so the great thing about this guy is he'd teach you Galbraith, he'd teach you Friedman, but he would advocate for both sides in such a convincing way.
Yeah.
Right? That you had no idea what his beliefs were, right? But I found by far the libertarian position to be the most compelling. And maybe it's just because I was young and, hadn't learned about the world yet. And so they were, I went, as a lot of reformed neolibertarians, they go through an anarchist stage, where you say, throw out everything. Like, why do we even need the police force? Like, Milton Friedman was weak. What do you mean public goods? What do you mean police forces? But then you kind of grow up, right? And at least I did. And, you learn, well, the world's pretty messy. It's pretty complicated. People's behavior is kind of impaired a lot of the time. People make bad decisions, right? And if they could go back and change their own decisions, they would. Uh-huh. There is a word called regret. Regret is a word that exists, right? And so you start to drift a little bit back, right? Which is kind of what happened to me. So I love the Greg Mankiw phrase, libertarian at the margin. I love that phrase, and I think that's kind of how I feel. Very often I push, guys, maybe we don't want to do that, or maybe we should just think about how to do this, right? And so that kind of is where I tend to fall in a lot of these debates, which is not uncommon for an economist. Yeah. I think a lot of economists have this kind of position.
Yeah, my personal path was being a like soft libertarian in high school, being like, oh, I don't really like the two parties, so this Ron Paul guy seems interesting.
Right.
And then getting to college, and then like ignoring politics for a while, and then getting to college, and I'm like, Bernie, he sounds excellent. This guy, he's really speaking.
Really? Yeah. You really went from one end of the...
I can't say my Bernie phase lasted long. Like, it was over probably halfway through the primary, and then I was like, kind of...
You mean 2016? 2016, yeah.
But then, like, halfway through the primary, I was just like, I think I just got frustrated with, like, his supporters, and I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore.
Yes.
And then this neoliberal community just popped up of, like, people who I think were frustrated with, like, the leftward turn of mostly online politics and how that was going, and also trying to, like, create a salient ideology for people who are like moderate Democrats, quote unquote. But then you'll find like the people who follow this account and are generally interested in neoliberalism, quote unquote, kind of cross-cut ideology and cross-cut party lines pretty evenly. Just because there's just a general frustration with populism on both sides.
Yes, and I think that is the wonderful part of it. There's no reason why it isn't. This is actually much more common in Australia than I found in America. So in Australia, a lot of my friends are either on the right or the left, but they have a kind of technocratic bent, or they're kind of a rationalist bent a little bit, right? And they have this common ground where they're all sort of different political persuasions, but they actually all agree. And mostly like they would do the same thing had they had a chance. And so there was a government in Australia from the early 80s through to the early 90s, Hawke and Keating. And I argue that a lot of people talk about Clinton, a lot of people talk about Blair, but Hawke and Keating came before those guys. They were progressive. They weren't conservatives like Thatcher. They weren't Republicans like Reagan. They were actually the Labour Party, right? They were a left-wing party, the party of the union movement in Australia, that massively deregulated the Australian economy. They floated the dollar. They taxed fringe benefits. They did all of these huge reforms through the 80s and 90s. Trade deliberalization, competition policy, all of these, what you would consider to be like gold standard neoliberal reforms, right? In the neoliberal in your sense of the word. And so my generation, I was born in 1986. I was born during the Hawke government, right? A lot of like technocratic people of my era have this kind of bent, which is like a progressive desire to help people, to improve the level of equality, to increase fairness, to solve environmental challenges that we have, all sorts of like progressive goals, but have this rationalist kind of way of approaching those problems. So there's a bunch of people I know who are exactly like this. And so when I heard about this neoliberal movement, I was like, I mean, I don't know about the naming, because if you talk to someone in England and you say to someone in England you're a neoliberal, they're like, what?
Though the worst reactions I've gotten from people in
no,
Central and
no,
South
no,
America, they hear that word and it's like, ooh, because you get much worse images when you hear neoliberal down there. But even still, like in England and Europe, it has like, it's very libertarian. It means what libertarian means in America, basically.
Yes, but in irrespective of the name, I think the movement has a lot of appeal. I don't agree with everything. I mean, some instances I disagree or think you need to go further or not as far, but it's a broad church, right? There's a bunch of views, and I think the basic organizing principle is this notion of progressive goals and practical, pragmatic,
methods,
kind of solutions to those goals that respect markets, respect behavior, and that to me is like, it describes my outlook perfectly. So I'm really glad you guys exist, and I'm glad about the advocacy work you do. And I love that you formed this community, online, that of people who, when they grow up and they become, they're maybe a lot of them are in their 20s right now. When they start moving up in the world, they'll be in positions where they can maybe influence things, right? So that's a really wonderful
Well, hopefully
thing.
this Twitch stream and you coming on influenced a few people to become hardcore neoliberals. And when they're technocrats pulling the strings
and
tax people. When they are tax people implementing tax policies, they'll think, oh, remember that time Stephen Hamilton told me what I should do? And they'll implement that policy.
Yeah,
hopefully
exactly.
That works.
Yeah, it's good. I'm really glad to have the chance to talk to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This is excellent. I'm glad you were our
Keep
first
safe.
guest.
Keep social distance. Don't touch your face.
I just touched my face before you said that.
Don't do it.
I got my handmade hand sanitizer.
And wash your hands liberally. Yes, good. Wash your hands liberally. And as I've been saying on Twitter, do whatever you possibly can do. If you're someone who is comfortable financially, do whatever you can do to support workers and small businesses
definitely.
At this time.
Take out won't kill you.
Any way you can.
Even going to the restaurant to pick up food won't kill you.
Yes.
Support
and
those people.
Tip generously.
Tip generously. If you can do it.
Tip more than you have ever tipped in your life.
I saw you did your $50 coffee tip. That's great.
Which seems crazy, but I was like, $50. Here you go. The consumer surplus I get out of this coffee shop through a year is a hell of a lot more than $50.
Exactly.
So take it, right? And so everyone needs to be. I don't know how lucky we're going to be with the government solving this problem, right? So ordinary people need to do whatever they can to help as quickly as possible. So that would be my pitch as I leave the Twitch.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much, and hopefully we can have you on another time.
Thanks, mate.
Have a good one.
Cheers. See you, mate.